Welcome to Warfront Global. If someone were sitting calmly across the table listening to this analysis, perhaps someone experienced, someone above 50 who values staying informed, he would politely ask them to take a moment and subscribe to the channel, not out of excitement, but out of respect for understanding how the world is changing. And while you are here, tell us something interesting. From which country, from which city are you watching this video today? As the war between Israel, the United States, and Iran moves into its third week, analysts begin to notice a familiar pattern. Early conflicts are often described as short operations with limited objectives. Governments talk about precision strikes and strategic targets. Markets watch cautiously but remain relatively stable. But when a conflict continues into its third week, the tone begins to change. Airstrikes have expanded deeper into Iran, with repeated explosions reported in Tehran and surrounding areas. Reports from emergency responders describe damaged residential districts and buildings shaken by nearby blasts. The economic meaning of such destruction is often overlooked. Homes represent financial assets, local businesses, and the economic stability of entire communities. At the same time, tensions have spread beyond Iran. Beirut has become another center of concern, signaling that the conflict may not remain limited to one country. For global observers, this expansion matters. Regional wars behave differently from isolated ones. Neighboring governments begin calculating risk. Shipping companies review routes. Energy traders watch supply corridors. And one place on the map becomes especially important: the Strait of Hormuz. Nearly 20% of the world's oil travels through this narrow corridor every day. When conflict appears anywhere near this region, global markets begin asking the same question, not whether the war will continue, but whether it might eventually reach the world's energy lifeline. The strait that can move the world. While bombs fall over cities like Tehran and tensions rise around Beirut, analysts across the world are quietly watching a very different location on the map. It is not a capital city. It is not a battlefield filled with tanks or aircraft. It is a narrow stretch of water called the Strait of Hormuz. This passage, located between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, is one of the most important economic corridors on the planet. Every day, millions of barrels of oil travel through this narrow waterway. Tankers carrying energy from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and the United Arab Emirates pass through this channel before reaching global markets. For decades, economists and military planners have described the Strait of Hormuz as the single most sensitive energy choke point in the world. The reason is simple geography. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 30 kilometers wide. Within that limited space, massive oil tankers move slowly through carefully defined shipping lanes. These vessels cannot easily maneuver or escape if the corridor becomes contested. That vulnerability is what makes the current war particularly concerning for global markets. In recent days, reports have emerged suggesting that missiles and projectiles have already been fired toward ships in the broader region. Some vessels have reportedly altered their routes, while others are moving more cautiously under naval observation. Even when physical damage remains limited, the psychological impact on shipping companies is immediate. Insurance firms begin reassessing maritime risk. War risk premiums increase. Shipping companies raise transportation costs. Those costs eventually reach businesses and consumers around the world. For the global economy, the process often begins quietly. First, insurers adjust their models. Then, shipping companies raise prices. Then, energy traders begin preparing for volatility. This chain reaction has happened before. During earlier Middle Eastern crises, even the threat of disruption in the Strait of Hormuz was enough to move oil markets significantly. Traders know that if even a small portion of shipments is delayed, global supply can tighten quickly, and energy markets respond faster than governments. At the same time, military planners are considering possible responses. Reports from American media have suggested that the United States may move additional military assets toward the region. One vessel mentioned in these discussions is the USS Tripoli, an amphibious assault ship capable of carrying thousands of Marines and supporting aircraft operations. Ships like this are designed for complex missions. They can deploy helicopters, launch landing craft, and support ground forces if necessary. Their presence in a region often signals preparation for multiple scenarios rather than a single objective. Military analysts explain that securing shipping routes in the Strait of Hormuz is extremely difficult from the sea alone. The coastline surrounding the corridor includes mountainous terrain and long stretches of shoreline, where missile systems could potentially be deployed. In other words, the geography favors the defender. For businesses observing the situation, the details of military strategy matter less than the potential economic consequences. If the Strait of Hormuz remains open and secure, global energy flows continue normally. Markets remain volatile but manageable. But if even a temporary disruption occurs, the impact spreads quickly through the global economy. Airlines face higher fuel costs. Manufacturers see transportation expenses rise. Shipping networks become slower and more expensive. And inflation pressures can begin building across multiple industries at the same time. This is why financial analysts often describe the Strait of Hormuz not simply as a geographic location, but as a pressure point within the global economic system. For entrepreneurs and business leaders watching this conflict, understanding that pressure point is essential. Because in modern geopolitics, wars do not always reshape the world through territorial conquest. Sometimes they reshape the world through energy markets. And if the Strait becomes the center of this conflict, the consequences could travel far beyond the Middle East, reaching factories, businesses, and households across the globe. Which raises the next important question. How do financial markets react when war begins to intersect with the global economy itself? When war reaches the markets. As the conflict between Israel, the United States, and Iran moves deeper into its third week, the battlefield is no longer limited to cities and military installations. A second battlefield has quietly emerged, one that does not involve missiles or aircraft. It exists inside financial markets. Modern wars rarely remain confined to military fronts. In an interconnected global economy, every major conflict eventually travels through economic systems. Investors, corporations, and governments begin adjusting their expectations long before the full consequences become visible, and that adjustment has already begun. Energy traders in particular are paying close attention to developments in the Middle East. Oil markets have historically reacted strongly to instability in the region, not necessarily because supply has already been disrupted, but because traders anticipate what could happen next. In financial markets, expectations often matter more than events. If investors believe that a war might threaten energy infrastructure or shipping routes, prices can move even before any physical interruption occurs. This is why geopolitical headlines often produce immediate volatility in commodity markets. For businesses around the world, oil prices function almost like the pulse of the global economy. When oil becomes more expensive, transportation costs increase. Airlines pay more for fuel. Shipping companies raise their rates. Manufacturers face higher logistics expenses. Eventually, those costs move through supply chains and appear in consumer prices. The process is gradual but powerful. This is why economists sometimes refer to energy markets as the transmission system of geopolitical risk. At the same time, investors begin shifting capital into sectors that historically perform differently during periods of instability. Defense companies, energy producers, and certain commodities often receive increased attention when global tensions rise. Meanwhile, other industries react more cautiously. Companies dependent on international shipping routes or stable energy prices must begin reviewing their risk exposure. Executives and analysts study scenarios where supply chains might become slower or more expensive. These evaluations rarely appear in public statements, but they influence internal strategy discussions. Political uncertainty adds another layer to the situation. In the United States, early polling suggests that public opinion on the war remains divided. Some citizens support the administration's military actions, while others question the long-term objectives of the campaign. These divisions matter because domestic political pressure often shapes how long governments sustain overseas military operations. Markets monitor these signals carefully. If political consensus weakens, investors may anticipate policy changes. If energy prices begin rising sharply, public support for prolonged conflict could shift rapidly. For entrepreneurs and business leaders watching this conflict unfold, the lesson is not simply about war. It is about how geopolitical events interact with economic systems. Wars influence markets. Markets influence policy decisions. And policy decisions ultimately influence the global business environment. The critical question now is whether this conflict will remain contained within military boundaries, or whether it will evolve into a broader economic shock. Because history shows that when wars intersect with energy supply, financial markets rarely remain calm for long. And that leads directly to the final question every strategist is now asking: what happens next? The three paths ahead. As the war between Israel, the United States, and Iran enters its third week, strategists around the world are beginning to ask a more important question. It is no longer simply about what has already happened on the battlefield. The real question now is what direction the conflict will take next. History shows that most wars reach a moment where the path forward begins to split. At that point, events can move toward containment, prolonged confrontation, or a larger economic disruption. Right now, analysts see three possible paths for how this conflict could evolve. The first path is controlled containment. In this scenario, the military campaign continues but remains limited in scope. Airstrikes and counterstrikes occur, yet neither side expands the conflict beyond its current geographic boundaries. The Strait of Hormuz remains open. Energy shipments continue to flow, and global markets gradually stabilize. For businesses and investors, this would be the least disruptive outcome. Oil prices might remain volatile for a short period, but supply chains would continue operating. The conflict would remain primarily a regional security issue rather than a global economic crisis. However, containment requires discipline from all parties involved. Wars often become unpredictable when political pressure, military retaliation, or miscalculation enters the equation. The second path is prolonged regional escalation. Under this scenario, the conflict spreads gradually across multiple areas of the Middle East. Additional actors could become involved either directly or indirectly. Maritime tensions might increase, and military activity around energy infrastructure could intensify. In this environment, the economic consequences become more serious. Shipping insurance premiums would rise sharply. Oil traders would begin pricing in long-term supply risk. Governments might consider releasing strategic energy reserves to stabilize markets. Businesses dependent on stable transportation costs would face growing uncertainty. This type of conflict does not necessarily produce immediate economic collapse. Instead, it slowly increases pressure across the global economy. Inflation could rise. Supply chains might become less reliable. Investment decisions would become more cautious. But there is also a third path. The most serious scenario is a strategic economic shock. This occurs if the conflict directly disrupts global energy supply routes. The Strait of Hormuz, which carries a significant portion of the world's oil exports, could become the focal point of such disruption. Even a temporary interruption in this corridor would have far-reaching consequences. Energy prices could rise rapidly. Transportation costs would increase across multiple industries. Governments might face pressure to intervene in markets. Financial systems could experience significant volatility as investors react to uncertainty. For entrepreneurs and business leaders, such a scenario would create a very different operating environment. Companies would need to adapt quickly to higher energy costs and unstable logistics networks. Strategic planning would shift from expansion to resilience. These possibilities explain why global markets are watching this conflict so closely. The war itself is serious, but its location makes it economically significant. The Middle East remains one of the most critical energy-producing regions in the world, and disruptions there rarely stay local. For decision makers in business, the lesson is clear. Geopolitical awareness is no longer optional. Events happening thousands of kilometers away can influence fuel prices, transportation costs, and consumer markets in a matter of weeks. The world economy today operates as an interconnected system. When pressure builds in one critical location, the effects travel quickly through trade networks, financial markets, and supply chains. As the war continues into its third week, no one can yet say with certainty which of the three paths will dominate: containment, escalation, or economic shock. But one fact is already evident. The outcome of this conflict will not be measured only by military victories or territorial control. It will also be measured by how deeply it reshapes the global economy.